Thanks. Hello, everyone. I'm here to welcome Erik Wielenberg. He's a professor of philosophy at DePauw University. He has published several books and articles on ethical theory and analytic philosophy of religion. Recently, he spent the 2014-2015 academic year as a fellow at the Center for Ethics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. The title of his paper is The Absurdity of Life in a Christian Universe as a Reason to Prefer that God Does Not Exist. Let us welcome Professor Wielenberg.
Class, could you raise the microphone now? All right. Okay, can everyone hear? Okay. All right. So I want to say thanks to class very much for organizing this fantastic conference, and to the other speakers. It's been truly a stimulating and fascinating array of papers. I've really enjoyed all the talks and the discussion surrounding them. I would also note the other talks have been very carefully thought out, precise, plausible, well-argued, in a word, responsible. What I hope to do with my talk is take things in a different direction. And we'll see how it goes. I also I like the co-author approach where there's someone you can turn to. I don't have a co-author. Class has graciously agreed to handle my questions and answers for me. Thanks in advance for that. All right. One more thing before I get into the talk. I should mention that the idea for the argument I'm going to give came to me through reflection on an exchange between Jeff Jordan and Steve Mateson. And so the argument I'm going to give is really based on some ideas that Steve put forward in that debate. I'm trying to take it even further. So whatever plausible parts there are due to Steve, and then the crazy parts are my addition. Okay, but so it's building on some work. It's an attempt to build on some work that Steve has already done. Okay, so let's get to it. It's sometimes claimed that life in a godless universe is, in some sense, absurd. More recently, Thomas Nagel's remark that he doesn't want God to exist has triggered a debate about whether it's rational to prefer God's non-existence to his existence. A lot of the discussion on that topic is about the axiological impact that God's existence or non-existence would have. I'm going to argue that the existence of the Christian God, I'll say a bit about what I mean by that in a moment, makes life absurd in a sense I'll define shortly. I will then propose that the fact that the existence of the Christian God makes life absurd is itself a reason to prefer that such a God not exist. So first, what does it mean to say that a life is absurd? And what is it about a godless universe that is supposed to make life absurd? William Craig is a prominent contemporary defender of this absurdity claim. He seems to have in mind the claim that in a godless universe, it would be very difficult or impossible for human beings to face certain aspects of reality without experiencing significant negative psychological consequences, such as madness or despair. So, consequently, according to Craig, it's impossible for us to live consistently and happily in a godless universe. Accordingly, I'll use the following definition of absurdity. This is on your handout. Claim C makes life absurd means that claim C's truth makes or would make true at least one claim C1, such that most actual human beings are such that if they were to accept C1, they would experience negative psychological consequences that would make it difficult or impossible for them to be happy without also failing to accept at least one entailment of C. So let me say a bit about this definition, three things in particular. First, I take the making true relation employed in the first part of the definition to be distinct from entailment. I'll not attempt to define what it is for one claim to make another claim true. A rough intuitive grasp of the concept will hopefully suffice. So an example from Michael DePauw may help illustrate the difference between entailment and making true as I'm understanding it. According to DePauw, William Paley maintained that the property of producing a greater balance of pleasure over pain than any alternative and the property of being commanded by God are both necessarily coextensive with the property of being morally obligatory. But Paley also maintained that it is being commanded by God that makes a given action obligatory. So producing a greater balance of pleasure over pain than any alternative entails that an action is obligatory, as does being commanded by God. However, only being commanded by God makes it true that an act is obligatory. So the making true relation employed in the definition of absurdity is a stronger relation than entailment. That's the first point. The second point is that the word actual in parentheses in the second line of the definition is intended to indicate that the definition is indexed to human beings as they actually are in our world. When evaluating whether a given claim is absurd, we look to the psychology of actual human beings. Third, the parenthetical component at the end of the definition is intended to capture Craig's talk of living consistently. According to Craig, one can sometimes avoid the negative psychological consequences that typically result from accepting a certain claim by failing to recognize the full implications of that claim. So Craig gives the case of Sartre as an example, claiming that Sartre accepted the claim that God does not exist, while at the same time holding that one can create meaning in one's own life. But according to Craig, the non-existence of God entails that it's impossible for one to create meaning in one's own life, and hence Sartre was able to live happily only by failing to accept all of the relevant entailments of atheism. Okay, let me turn to the main argument. Let me say a bit about the use of the word God in this argument. So in this talk, I use the word God to indicate the God of traditional Christianity. God so construed has at least the following features. He's omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. Moreover, he has these features essentially, meaning that it's impossible for him to exist and not have these features. He's also essentially triune, meaning that he's three persons in one God. Finally, I'll assume that it's an essential feature of the Christian God that he has commanded us to love him with all our hearts and to love our neighbors as ourselves. I'm happy for that last assumption to be taken as stipulative. My aim is to show that the existence of an essentially perfect being who has commanded us to love our neighbors as ourselves makes life absurd in the sense just defined. And so I'll use the term God to refer to such a being. With that in mind, here's my main argument. This is on the handout. I'm going to go ahead and read it, just in case some people are watching the video and don't have a copy of the handout handy. So let's go through the main steps, and then I'll say a bit about each of the premises. So here's what I call the absurdity argument. Premise one, necessarily, if God exists, then whenever a person P experiences undeserved involuntary suffering, that suffering produces a net benefit for P. Step two, so necessarily, if God exists, then whenever a person A causes another person B to experience undeserved involuntary suffering, A produces a net benefit for B. Step three, God's existence makes it true, or would make it true, that each of us is morally obligated to pursue the good of others. Step four, necessarily, if one, A is morally obligated to pursue B's good, and two, by doing X, A would produce a net benefit for B, then three, A has a prima facie moral obligation to perform X. Step five, so God's existence makes it true, or would make it true, that, and I'll call this claim X, each of us has a prima facie moral obligation to cause others to experience undeserved involuntary suffering. And then finally, premise six, most human beings are such that if they were to accept that claim X, they would experience negative psychological consequences that would make it difficult or impossible for them to be happy without also failing to accept at least one entailment of X. And the conclusion, therefore, the claim that God exists makes life absurd. In the rest of this talk, I'll defend the premises of this argument, or at least say something about each of them, and make the case that if the conclusion of the argument is true, that constitutes a reason to desire that God does not exist. So let's start with the first premise. Seems like a good place to start. I just said I'll defend the premises. Not so much with premise one. I'll offer some considerations in favor of it, but then I'll sort of explain why. Even if I can't give a full defense of it, it's worth drawing out. I think it's worth drawing out. Thinking about its implications. So this premise is, I say, widely but not universally accepted by contemporary Christian philosophers as well as contemporary philosophical critics of Christianity. That might be overstated, but it's well represented. It's on the menu. Let's put it that way. Part of the justification for the premise is that a morally perfect God would not permit the existence of any gratuitous evil, evil that is not necessary in order to prevent an equal or worse evil, or necessary to produce some greater good, some great good. However, the claim that God's existence entails the non-existence of gratuitous evil does, of course, not by itself entail premise 1. Premise 1 depends on the further claim that if God permits a certain evil to befall a particular individual, God's moral perfection requires not merely that the evil be compensated for somewhere in the universe, but that the evil be compensated for in the life of the very person who endures that evil. Premise 1 deals with the specific evil of suffering, claiming that a morally perfect God allows a person to experience involuntary and undeserved suffering only if such suffering ultimately makes that person better off overall than she would have been otherwise. And we might call suffering of that sort patient-benefiting suffering. One justification for this stronger claim is advanced by Stephen Mateson, who argues that, my pages are stuck together, that's not his argument, who argues that if God allows a person to experience involuntary and undeserved suffering in order to prevent a great evil or attain a great good, but not for the sufferer, then God treats the sufferer as a mere means to an end, which is incompatible with God's moral perfection. I take it that Mateson provides at least a strong prima facie case for the first premise. In any case, the idea that suffering ultimately benefits the sufferer is a prominent theme in traditional Christianity. And finally, the fact that premise 1 is so widely accepted among contemporary philosophers of religion means that drawing out its full implications is a philosophical interest for that reason alone. Looking ahead to the Q&A, I should say I really don't have anything more to say in defense of premise 1. And so if you ask me about that premise, I'm answering the question that might arise. I'm really just going to fall back on the last point, which I think is true. It's a case where here's a position that enough influential people accept it or find it plausible that it's worth thinking about its implications. And so I'm not prepared to offer any sort of full-on defense of that claim. Okay, premise 2. Suppose that A causes B to experience some involuntary and undeserved suffering. From 1, God's existence entails that B's suffering is patient-benefiting suffering. So A produces a net benefit for B. God's existence means that human beings can exploit what Jeff Jordan calls a kind of divine fail-safe device to benefit one another by causing each other to experience undeserved and involuntary suffering. So consider premise 3. According to Jesus, the 2 greatest commandments are to love God with all your heart and to love your neighbor as you love yourself. A variety of views have been advanced regarding the full meaning of the love your neighbor commandment. However, a central element of the traditional Christian view is that loving someone includes desiring the good for that person. Now, an important wrinkle here is that our desires typically are not under the direct control of our wills in the way that, for example, many bodily movements are. Under normal circumstances, I can make my arm go up simply by deciding to raise it. However, I typically cannot make myself have a certain desire simply by deciding to have that desire. Recognizing this point, some thinkers have suggested that what we ought to do in light of the command to love our neighbors is to act as if we love them in the reasonable hope that over time we will come genuinely to love them. In light of this, we can say that among the moral requirements imposed by the command to love others is the obligation to do what we can to promote what is genuinely good for others. Thus, the existence of God entails that God has commanded each of us to love others as we love ourselves, and hence the existence of that God makes it true that each of us is morally obligated to pursue the good of others. Furthermore, Jesus' words make it clear that such an obligation is not merely one among many, rather it is one of our most important moral obligations. Okay, let me turn to 4. It occurs to me it might be helpful to just restate each premise before I say a bit about it. So premise 4 is the claim that says, necessarily, if A is morally obligated to pursue B's good, and by doing action X, A would produce a net benefit for B, then A has a prima facie moral obligation to perform act X. Okay, so if A is morally obligated to pursue B's good, and A could produce a net benefit for B by performing some act X, then it seems clear that A has at least a prima facie obligation to perform X. Speaking in terms of reasons, we can say that A has a defeasible moral reason to perform act X. The obligation here is only prima facie, or the reason is merely a defeasible reason, because the fact that A could produce a net benefit for B by performing some act X might be outweighed or overridden by other features of the situation, so that A's all things considered moral obligation is to perform some other act. For example, perhaps there is something other than X that A could do that would provide an even greater benefit for B. Or perhaps act X, while benefiting B, would harm a million other people, or perhaps A has made an important promise not to perform X, and so on. However, as I noted in the defense of the third premise, Jesus' words indicate that our obligation to promote the good of others is a particularly weighty one. So the prima facie obligation to benefit another will not be easily outweighed. Okay, premise 5. Premise 5 says that God's existence makes it true, or would make it true, that claim X, each of us has a prima facie moral obligation to cause others to experience undeserved involuntary suffering. So suppose that God exists. 3 tells us that we have an obligation to pursue the good of others, and 2 tells us that one way of promoting another's good is to cause her to experience involuntary and undeserved suffering. From 4, it follows that each of us has a prima facie duty or a defeasible moral reason to cause others to experience involuntary and undeserved suffering. That's claim X. Ordinarily, we tend to think that the default position with respect to others is that we should not cause them to suffer. We need a good excuse for causing another to suffer. But claim X says that if God exists, then the opposite is true. The default position with respect to others is that we should cause them to suffer. We need a good excuse for refraining from causing another to suffer. Okay, finally, let me turn to premise 6, and this, I think, at least I have the most to say about this premise. So 6 is the claim that most human beings are such that if they were to accept this claim X, they would experience negative psychological consequences that would make it difficult or impossible for them to be happy unless they failed to accept some entailment of X. So here's what I have to say in support of that premise. Any attempt to establish that a given claim makes life absurd, the way I've defined absurdity, will consist of 2 main parts. One part will be philosophical. That part consists of making the case that the target claim has certain salient implications. The other part will be psychological. That part consists of making the case that acceptance of the salient implications will have significant negative psychological consequences for most human beings. Once these 2 components are distinguished, it's clear that any plausible version of the second component will be informed by work in psychology. So premises 1 through 5 of this argument are devoted to bringing out the salient implications of the existence of God, as defined earlier. It's here in defense of premise 6 that psychological considerations come to the fore. To begin, note that it seems likely that most human beings would find X's truth to be depressing and demoralizing. I take it that X strikes most of us, actually all of us, as morally perverse. It runs contrary to the natural moral tendencies of most human beings. Our natural inclination is to believe its opposite, namely that we all have reason to avoid inflicting involuntary and undeserved suffering on others. Thus, those who accept X would likely find themselves continuously struggling to hold on to a depressing belief that contradicts what they are naturally inclined to believe. This is an obstacle to happiness that would afflict the vast majority of humans who believe X. To see some additional obstacles to happiness for those posed by this claim X, we can divide believers in X into 2 groups. First, those who succeed in acting in conformity with their belief in X, and those who fail. Consider the first group first. Those who accept X should conclude that they ought to be inflicting extreme suffering on a great many people. If X is true, then whenever one can inflict involuntary and undeserved suffering on another, no matter how extreme, one has a prima facie obligation to do so. In light of the weighty nature of this prima facie obligation, those who accept X should often conclude that they have an actual, all things considered, moral obligation to inflict such suffering. Putting aside sociopaths, who constitute a very small proportion of the population, human beings find it unpleasant to witness or even imagine the suffering of others, as noted as far back as the 4th century BC by Mencius. Most people also find it quite unpleasant to inflict significant suffering on others, even when they believe that doing so is justified. As a mundane example, many parents find it unpleasant to help or even permit doctors to give their children important but painful vaccinations, even when such parents fully grasp the justification behind such vaccinations. A less mundane example involves the general reluctance of soldiers in combat situations to kill the enemy. So here I appeal to a book called On Killing, which is focused especially on killing in war and combat situations. The author is named Dave Grossman, and he says this: "The vast majority of combatants throughout history, at the moment of truth when they could and should kill the enemy, have found themselves to be conscientious objectors." Grossman argues convincingly in his extended study of killing in war that one of the psychological costs of up-close killing, even when seen by its perpetrators as justified, is guilt. Indeed, the guilt associated with up-close killing often produces physical revulsion and vomiting on the part of the killer. Furthermore, the guilt of such killing is a significant contributor to psychiatric casualties, much more so than the fear of death or injury to oneself. So the relevance of this is that to accept and live in accordance with X is to make inflicting suffering on others a central aspect of one's life. Unless one is a sociopath, this is a recipe for severe psychological trauma. So most people who act in conformity with X would experience significant negative psychological consequences that will make happiness difficult or impossible to obtain. Of course, not all who recognize the existence of such an obligation to impose suffering will actually do so. Some will instead experience weakness of will, failing to do what they genuinely believe they morally ought to do. People in this category will be susceptible to what psychologists have labeled moral injury, a psychological affliction that occurs when one acts in a way that runs contrary to one's most deeply held moral convictions. Journalist David Wood characterizes moral injury as the pain that results from damage to a person's moral foundation. As Wood notes, moral injury is sometimes a result of killing that one judges to be wrong. However, it is also sometimes a result of failing to fight as or when one thinks one ought to. It is this second sort of moral injury to which those who genuinely believe they ought to inflict involuntary and undeserved suffering on others but fail to do so will be susceptible. The effects of moral injury are comparable to those of PTSD. Chronic and repeated moral injury will make it difficult to be happy. Therefore, those who accept this claim X face a terrible dilemma. Face the psychic trauma associated with inflicting severe suffering on others, or endure chronic moral injury. In this way, most people who accept X will find it difficult to be happy. Since the existence, if the argument I gave before is right, the existence of the Christian God makes true or would make true claim X, it follows that the claim that such a God exists makes life absurd in the way I've defined. Okay, so that completes my explanation, defense of what I've called the absurdity argument. And so in the final portion of the talk here, I want to draw on this argument to connect it more directly to what's the topic of this conference. So I'm going to consider now some implications of this absurdity argument. Now, one natural thought is that the fact that the existence of God makes life absurd means that the existence of God somehow makes the universe worse. And the fact that the existence of God makes the universe worse is a reason to prefer that God not exist. So this is what I've labeled the first suggestion on the handout. I should perhaps note at this point that the handout has two sides, and there is indeed a second suggestion that I'll get to shortly. So to think about the first suggestion, first consider the thesis that Cray and Dragos call wide impersonal anti-theism, which I'll simply call anti-theism. So at this point, I should also point out, I'm rehearsing some arguments put forward by Crass and Dragos that seem to me convincing, and I think overlap with some other ideas that have come out already. And so basically, I'm going to just explain why I don't think the first suggestion is particularly promising. Okay, so here's anti-theism. For each theistic world which is sufficiently similar to the actual world in the relevant ways, all else equal, the axiological downsides of God's existence suffice to make that world far worse overall than it would otherwise be on naturalism. So it might be thought that one could use the conclusion of the absurdity argument to argue for the truth of anti-theism. A natural way of developing such an argument would be as follows. Any theistic world that is sufficiently similar to the actual world in the relevant ways is one in which there's a truth that makes life absurd, and hence is a world in which most human beings cannot live happily and consistently. Such absurdity is a significant axiological downside of God's existence. On the other hand, if naturalism is true, then the problematic absurdity is absent, and so is the axiological downside. So that's an argument you might be tempted by, But I doubt that any argument of this sort can succeed. Such an argument faces two significant obstacles. The first is that God himself is tremendously, perhaps infinitely valuable, and so God will greatly, perhaps infinitely, enhance the overall value of every world in which he exists. Again, this is rehearsing some points made by Dragos. It's plausible that the value contributed to a world by God's existence outweighs the axiological downside of the absurdity of life. The second obstacle is that since God's existence entails the non-existence of gratuitous evil, any evil that is a consequence of God's existence will not make the world worse overall, again, as Dragos suggest. Consequently, if the absurdity of life is a genuine evil, God's existence entails that it does not make the world worse overall. I'm also pessimistic about the prospects of appealing to the absurd nature of a theistic universe to reach the conclusion that God's existence makes the world worse for some people. So this view is what Dragos call wide personal anti-theism, and I'll just call it personal anti-theism. So this is the view that there's at least one person P, such that for each theistic world, which is sufficiently similar to our world in the relevant ways, and in which P exists, all else equal, the axiological downsides of God's existence suffice to make that world far worse overall for P than it would be otherwise on naturalism. Now, in defending premise 6 of my argument, I made the case that anyone who accepts claim X is on the horns of a dilemma, facing psychological distress resulting either from inflicting suffering on others or from moral injury. One might be tempted to argue that any psychological distress that results from this dilemma is an axiological downside of God's existence, and hence people who experience such distress are made worse off overall than they would be in a naturalist world. However, because it is plausible that all such psychological distress, a kind of suffering, is involuntary and undeserved, it's plausible that the first premise of my argument entails that in a theistic universe, all such psychological distress produces a net benefit for the sufferer, and hence does not make the sufferer worse off overall. Therefore, as far as I can see, the absurdity argument I've defended here does not provide the materials for a promising argument for either anti-theism or personal anti-theism. Okay, now I want to shift to what I've called the second suggestion. We should recall that much of the debate over the axiological impact of God's existence or non-existence appears to have been inspired by Thomas Nagel's description of what he calls his fear of religion. Nagel writes, this is a quotation at the top of the front of the handout. So it seems to be a remark that kind of got all this in motion, this debate, and set this debate in motion. But what Nagel originally said was, it isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. Now, it's significant, I think, that Nagel nowhere claims that God's existence makes the universe worse. Noticing this points us toward the thought that the fact that God's existence makes life absurd is itself a reason to desire that God not exist, at least for those who are somewhat uncertain about whether God exists. So, suppose you are uncertain as to whether P is the case. One reason you might have to desire that P not be the case is that if P were the case, then the universe would be worse overall or worse for someone than it would be if P were not the case. But it seems to me that that is not the only reason you could have to desire that P not be the case. I submit that if P's being the case would make life absurd, then you have a reason to prefer that P not be the case, a reason that is entirely independent of whether P's being the case would make the universe worse overall or worse for someone. When I reflect on the nature of the theistic universe that is revealed by the absurdity argument, I find that I want our universe not to be like that. It seems to me that something is wrong with a universe in which human beings cannot face the important truth that God exists and live consistently and happily. I don't want the universe to be absurd. That the Christian God would make the universe absurd is a reason to desire that the Christian God not exist. So that's the second suggestion. Now, one objection to this line of thought starts with the claim that if God does exist, then a world containing God is the best of all possible worlds. Since it is not reasonable to desire that the best of all possible worlds not obtain, it is not reasonable to desire that God does not exist. That's the objection. In response, I offer the following example. This is on the handout. Suppose you know that if you will suffer extreme agony for the next 10 years, then the best possible life for you is one in which you suffer such agony. I think that it's rational for you to want not to experience the agony and to want the best possible life for you not to be one in which you suffer extreme agony for the next 10 years. Similarly, if you know that if you will suffer extreme agony for the next 10 years, then the best possible world is one in which you experience such agony, then it's reasonable for you to want not to experience the agony and to want the best possible world not to be one in which you suffer that agony. Also similarly, even if we know that if God exists, then this is the best of all possible worlds, it may be rational to desire that God not exist and to desire that the best of all possible worlds be one in which human beings can live consistently and happily while facing reality. Though I can't argue for it here, I think that arguments for the view that the non-existence of God is absurd are unsuccessful. If the claim that God exists makes life absurd, and the claim that God does not exist does not make life absurd, then I think that this constitutes a reason to prefer God's non-existence to his existence. For it's rational for us to want the best of all possible worlds to be one in which human beings can live consistently and happily. Of course, there may be other reasons for preferring that God does exist. However, the existence of a reason to desire that God does not exist that has no corresponding reason for desiring that God does exist at least opens the door to the possibility that it is rational, all things considered, to desire that God not exist, even if God's existence does not make the world worse overall or worse overall for some particular person. Thank you.